Hello, and welcome to Controversies in Church History. My name is Derek Taylor, and this is the podcast that goes through all of the major, or the greatest, most important major events, personalities, ideas, controversial ones in the life and history of the Roman Catholic Church. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you to everyone who listens out there. Thank you especially to our patrons on Patreon and everyone who supported the podcast. Hope you guys are doing well. Remember, if you would like to subscribe to the podcast, you can go follow us on Spotify, where I'm hosted now, or Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen should be available. Also have a channel on YouTube where I post the podcast. And also you can find us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, go like the page, and our website, churchcontroversies.com. I sometimes post links to things there. I've been behind posting them. I actually have a new article out in Crisis Magazine. I'll also write there as well. And if you would like to become a patron of the podcast and help out and donate, you can do that. Controversies in Church History has a Patreon page, and donation levels beginning with $5 a month. So thank you, everyone, again. Welcome to this episode, this single episode, which is a re-recording. This episode is on the Arian Crisis, 320 or so, circa 320 to about 381. And actually, this is, if you don't know the history of the podcast, that this had been something I was doing as a sort of like lecture series once a month at my local parish, and this is one of the last ones I think I did before the lockdowns killed off the monthly lecture series. Nobody showed up after it came back a year and a half later or whatever it was, and so we started doing it as a podcast. And I'm re-recording some of these lectures because the sound quality is not great. This one also because it was a little, for a variety of reasons, a little rushed. My presentation, I thought, of the Arian Crisis, so I'm redoing it, but also because it's a good time for it, I think. If you're listening to this, you're probably familiar to at least some degree with the Arian Crisis of the 4th century. And because, this is 2023, this is the 10th anniversary of the election of Pope Francis. Because if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably aware we're going through a crisis. Have been for a while now in the Catholic Church. And sometimes people like to compare what's going on now to the Arian crisis of the fourth crisis of the 4th century. So that would be a good time to go revisit it. Talk about, by the way, comparisons between what was going on then and the crisis today. So we'll get to some of that, but also as well a background on what this was and why it happened. So without further ado, let us begin. If you don't know, I'm not going to spend too much time on the Council of Nicaea. I have a separate episode on the actual council. But in the early church, in the early 4th century, by the early 4th century, there were debates breaking out amongst bishops and other peoples in the early church over the nature of the divinity of Christ. And if you read the Gospels, you read early Christian writings, followers of Jesus believed he was God himself, that he was God. But of course, the scriptures don't really explain in any great detail how he was God. And this is kind of what happens in the late third, well, even before the late 3rd century, but definitely by the early 4th century, there's a big debate about, okay, how can he be God if he's a human being, Jesus of Nazareth, an historical person? And the controversy we're talking about here centered around a man named Arius, who was a popular deacon of the city of Alexandria in Egypt, born in Libya, but his background before about 318 or so AD is some kind of sketchy, but he was popular, had a large following in the city. He had studied under a theologian named Lucian of Antioch, who was martyred during the Diocletian persecutions of the early 4th century, about 312. And by all accounts, from what survived of his writings and from descriptions of other of his opponents, he was a very good logician, insisted on logical rigor, philosophical rigor, and he was known for his austere way of life and impressive demeanor. Most of our sources about him actually come from later hostile figures, but we can give a good sketch of what he believed with some precision. And one of the things Arius was concerned about from earlier Christian thinkers was a desire to safeguard the unity and the transcendence of God the Father, that God is one and that he is beyond all created things. He's not a part of nature or anything like this. This is, again, a background in which, by the time this breaks out, Christianity is a force in the Roman world now, and you have people who have embraced it, who come from classically educated backgrounds. And in that background, you go back to the Greek philosophy, the idea that God is immutable, impassible, he can't change, he can't suffer. So the idea that he would be sort of, in the world, the actual God himself, the eternal, immutable, unchanging God himself, was something that was hard for them to deal with intellectually speaking. And this was effectively Arius' concern. And his idea was that only God the Father, only God alone by himself, was what he called, what sometimes called unoriginate, eternal, and no other being could share in his essence or in his substance. Otherwise, he would not be one God. This excluded, of course, the Son, and therefore Christ, because, of course, Jesus was supposed to be, according to, and by the way, the early Christians did identify him as the Son of God, so, what does that mean? Well, it's Christ, and therefore Arius rejects this idea. He quite openly states that the Word, or the Son of God, could only be a creature, even if he was divine in some sense, usually as a matter of, a created creature participating in the being of God. But so then could other creatures. Long story short, he gets in trouble with the Bishop of Alexandria, who convenes a synod of the city, assembly of Egyptian bishops, and condemns Arius as a heretic and exiles him. This leads to eventually to the calling of the Council of Nicaea, because this thing is so this conflict gets so big, and Constantine the emperor convenes this synod. They eventually adopt the idea that what they come to describe, and this is really inside baseball here, but this rebuttal to this idea of Arius, that he, the Son of God, had been created, was to say that he was homoousios. The Greek means he's of the same substance as the Father. And then it condemned Arius, and it produced this creed, the Nicene Creed, at least the first version of it. It's not the one we actually recite today at Mass, but and so you had this production of this creed. This is supposed to, they did other things at that council. This is supposed to end the debate. However, it did not, for several reasons. A couple of them is that, on the one hand, this seemed to say, okay, he's of the same, Son of God is of the same substance as the Father. What does that mean? Does that mean physical substance? Of course, that would be, God's supposed to be spirit, according to the Gospel of John. This is partly because of that term itself. It was kind of ambiguous. Homoousios could mean physical substance. In fact, it had something like 28 meanings scholars have been able to figure out. They also used another word, like hypostasis, to refer to Jesus. And by the way, these terms, they'll eventually become, you've probably heard ousia means substance, perhaps, or hypostasis is equated to our English word person. These terms didn't have those well-defined meanings in the early 4th century. They could mean a lot of different things. And in fact, again, these Greek theologians, this is mostly Greek-speaking theologians here, are struggling to explain how God could be both 1 and 3 at the same time, who could both be eternal and, and in the world at the same time. And so they had to invent new meanings for words like hypostasis had almost never been used in classical Greek, that term. So they're using these words interchangeably. They're using the same terms to mean different things. So there's a lot of confusion, semantically speaking. And so there's no agreement on which the proper meanings of these words were. The other reason it didn't tamp down the conflict is that the term homoousios, or homoousion, which version of the word, was suspect to a lot of early Christian thinkers. Why? Because it had been used in previous writings by Gnostic heretics, Gnostic writers of the 3rd century, who used those terms. So it had this kind of icky, it was like it would be like, I don't know, using I'm trying to think of a contemporary connotation, but it'd be like adopting Marxist terminology or something and putting into the church's definitions or something. It was weird to people. And one thing to note about this, by the way, about this crisis that really the Council of Nicaea just kind of kicked off, because it actually, as you see, that confusion causes a lot of the problems. This was done in the East by Greek-speaking theologians. The West was, theologically speaking, underdeveloped at the beginning of the 4th century. It had something of a vocabulary to describe God in Trinitarian terms, but it was not nearly as refined as that of the Eastern Church, which is why a lot of Latin theologians didn't understand what was going on at first. They thought it was just some sort of a Greek thing. It's not until later in about the middle of the century when St. Hilary of Poitiers will take up a defense of the Council of Nicaea against the Arians, that Western theology will catch up. So it's mostly an Eastern thing to begin with. The other thing to note about this is that this conflict over theological dispute was partly, it was so bitter, it was because of the emperors at the time, with Constantine, became Christian. And so they were invested in this. They wanted to have unity in the empire. That's why Constantine called the First Council of Nicaea. It also happened to be part of the background because in the 4th century, the Roman Empire underwent a series of shocks, particularly defeats in battle. The Emperor Julian the Apostate in Christian history in 363 suffers defeat at the hands of the Persians, the Persian Emperor Shapur I. And later on, we'll come back to this, the Eastern Emperor Valens is killed at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 by a Gothic army. And so this must have added to the sense that, whoever was wrong in this conflict must be causing the empire to suffer, right? Because you're getting this vital doctrine wrong. So there's both directly, because the emperors will intervene in this, by the way. They're a major cause. They back one side and then the other, so that's another huge cause. So it's something to keep in mind as we're talking about this. And just to set the scene for you, if you don't know, Constantine the Great and publicly embraces Christianity in 312 when he becomes ruler of the Western Empire, and then later on, about a dozen years later, becomes the sole ruler of the empire. But even 312, he begins identifying with the Christian God, becomes a patron of the Christian Church, and when he does take over, becomes sole ruler. That reshapes the empire, because now Christianity is an official force within the Roman world. But it also has a direct effect on the emperors after him. Because when he dies in 337, he has 3 sons to whom he leaves his empire. And Constantine himself was a ruthless character, but his sons were as well. And on their orders, after he dies, the 3 sons who were in line to inherit basically ordered the army to massacre the rest of Constantine's family, except for 2 of his cousins. And they divided the empire between them. In the eastern part of the empire, Greece, modern-day Turkey, the Middle East, Constantius II calls himself Augustus, which is the title of the emperors. His son Constantine II takes power in the west, which is Britain, Spain, and Gaul. And then in the center of the empire, Constans I. He wasn't very imaginative with these names for his sons, but he rules over Italy and Illyricum, which is kind of in the Balkans to a certain degree. So he has this 3 sons, rule this tripartite empire. And it doesn't last very long because they've come to blows almost immediately. Constans I gets into a battle with Constantine II in the west and defeats him in 340. And Constantine II dies in battle. So Constantine becomes, emperor of the west as well. And so Constans, this is important to note because Constans was a supporter of the Nicene settlement, as most bishops in the West were at that point, and was a supporter of the major figure at this is 340. The major figure supporting the cause of Nicene Orthodoxy was Athanasius of Alexandria. He was a great saint. While his counterpart, Constantius II, supported Arianism. And in fact, in 340, Athanasius is in exile because Constantius II has exiled him. And this will be a theme throughout this episode. And yet, Constans was the support. Things change in 350 because he is murdered by a man named Magnus Magnentius, who's a usurper who defeats him in battle and then murders him. And eventually, a year later, Constantius II comes from the east, defeats Magnentius, and becomes sole emperor in 351, which he will reign for the next 10 years as sole emperor. He will spend a lot of his reign fighting threats on the borders, places in the Persians and elsewhere. And he will actually die on his way back west to deal with the revolt of his cousin, Julian the Apostate, in 361. So you have this infighting for several decades after Constantine's death in 337. And once he's dead, once Constantine has passed, you have a reaction against the Nicene settlement. And there are two groups of people who made this happen. One were sympathizers, like the two Eusebii. There were two bishops, prominent ones at the Council of Nicaea, Bishop of Eusebius of Caesarea and Eusebius of Nicomedia, which is in Turkey. And so they're leaders of this first group they'd voted for the creed, but only because Constantine had pressured them to do so. And then there were many others who were probably more numerous, who were more or less orthodox, but who were suspicious of the non-biblical and Gnostic heritage of the word homoousios. It was a non-biblical word, too, is one of the things they had a problem with. All the terms, by the way, that Arius used to make his arguments, they refused to use non-biblical phrases, so they're kind of biblicists in that regard. And this group, led by the two Eusebii, soon after Nicaea began holding synods and deposing all the leaders of the Nicene settlement. People like Marcellus of Ancyra, the bishop, other bishops, a man named Eustathius of Antioch, but most prominently, of course, Athanasius of Alexandria. He managed to get himself reinstated once Constantine died, but of course, imperial politics guaranteeing divisions would continue. In 338, Eusebius of Nicomedia gets himself installed as Bishop of Constantinople. In the same year, a council at Antioch deposes Athanasius and orders a second exile for him. He flees Alexandria in 339 at risk of being expelled, and a man from Cappadocia named Gregory takes over as Bishop of Athanasius C. And so, as I mentioned before, after the death of Constantine II in the West, who supported Nicene Christianity, Constans becomes sole ruler. He supports the Nicenes and Athanasius, and so you have this. You do have this attempt to try to patch things up while he's alive. At a synod in Rome in that same year, Julius I, the Pope at the time, receives Marcellus of Ancyra and Athanasius in Rome. At a synod there, he acknowledges Athanasius and Marcellus are not guilty of any heresy, confirms Athanasius, I think confirms them both as bishops of their sees. So you have this division open up between East and West now, and you also have a series of councils. There was a council held in Antioch in 341, which there are almost all Eastern bishops. They're all hostile to Athanasius. And they issue the first of multiple Arian confessions that begin to produce a formal doctrine of faith opposed to that of Nicene, the Nicene statement. And so you have this sort of counter, creation of synods, calling of synods, counter synods. And the next year there's a response to this. The Council of Serdica. Constans and Constantius both agreed to hold a council to resolve this issue, and it meets at Serdica, which I believe is in Italy. I don't remember exactly where, but it fails because the Eastern bishops who show up there challenge the right of Athanasius to be there. They don't consider him a bishop anymore. The Western bishops release a statement claiming to be an attack on Arianism, but which stresses the unity of the Father and Son without addressing how they could be separate. And again, this is part of the problem. They don't know how to do that as of yet in language that'll make it clear to people. And so the Eastern bishops leave. They retire to Greece, to Philippopolis, and they release a statement justifying the deposition of Athanasius and Marcellus of Ancyra, and they condemn the Pope and others who were at that council. And in fact, they append one of these creeds that they'd written, had been written at the Council of Antioch the year before, with additional anathemas directed at Marcellus of Ancyra. And so you have all this going on. In fact, in another council a couple of years later, in Antioch, another one, there's a fifth Arian confession, sometimes called the Macrostiche, which is a longer version of this Eastern version of this Arian creed, and written longer to address Western bishops, and it's presented to Western bishops in Milan, and it's conciliatory in nature, and it replaces the term that they found offensive, homoousios, of like substance, with the term homoousios, which means of like substance. So you have a change from of the same substance to of like substance. And this will be picked up later on, as we'll see, this desire to be conciliatory. And it'll be a feature of later Arian thinking, trying to create vague or capacious proposals that'll sort of paper over differences. And within a few years, once again, Athanasius had been exiled again. He's exiled 5 different times, actually, throughout this whole period. And he comes back once the Bishop of Alexandria dies in 346. Another council is held in Milan in 347, which actually deposes someone who's associated with Marcellus of Ancyra. And for reasons that become clear at this point, Athanasius basically sort of washes his hand of Marcellus because he realizes their theology is actually kind of hanky. It's heretical for reasons that I won't go into and won't dwell on it, but he realized there were problems with what he was saying. And Athanasius had been, as he goes over time, his theology develops, because people are working out the meanings of all these, confusing words here. And so you have this precarious peace that's brokered by Constans and Constantius, which comes to an end in 350, when Constans is killed, and Pope Julius dies 2 years later. And so the ascension of Constantius as sole emperor kind of changes the dynamic of the conflict because he supports Arianism. And so again, more councils are held. In 351, a second council at Sirmium is held, which produces another confession of faith. And they and so you have this going on. A year later, Eastern bishops send a delegation to the new Pope, Liberius, and present him with a written protest against Athanasius. Constantius then sends an envoy to Alexandria demanding Athanasius' resignation. But Athanasius, rather shrewdly, refuses unless the order came from the emperor himself. The Western bishops ask Constantius to convene a council, which is held at Arles. But when it is held there, Constantius pressures the bishops into condemning Athanasius. So, because he's being accused, the Pope asks for another council, which meets at Milan in 355, a couple of years later. At this council, when Athanasius' supporters try to put the Nicene Creed before the bishops to sign it, the supporters of the emperors rise and threaten them all with exile if they don't condemn Athanasius. Only 3 were refused and sent into exile. The next year, Hilary of Poitiers became another prominent bishop who resisted Constantius. He was also exiled for his pains. And so the Pope writes 3 letters to these exiled bishops, trying to, stay in connection with them, but his messengers were arrested. And an envoy came to Rome demanding he appear before the emperor at Milan. Liberius refused, but he was taken away by force in the night to Milan, where after defending himself and refusing to condemn Arius, he was exiled to Thrace. And thereafter, Constantius appointed a deacon named Felix to be pope in his stead. And so you have this, again, this campaign to get rid of these supporters of the Nicene settlement, including, of course, Athanasius, having dealt with the Western bishops. Constantius turns backing into Athanasius in 356. Actually, at the date, February 8th. Imperial troops actually broke into the church in Alexandria, where Athanasius was celebrating a vigil liturgy, and he had to flee to the desert, to the monks of Egypt, where he had their support. And so, for the next, I think, 4 or 5 years, he moves around. That is 5 years, excuse me. It's next 5 years, he moves around from place to place, sheltered by his supporters, all the while issuing writings defending the Nicene faith. And someone else, a man named George, is named bishop of Alexandria. And so you have this, again, this campaign by Constantius. To do this, you have several more councils. Again, I won't go through all these local synods and councils. One I'll mention in 357, the year after Athanasius is exiled, the Third Council of Sirmium. And I mention this because, again, you have this, this efforts to create this sort of compromise creed, sometimes referred to as the blasphemy by Hilary of Poitiers, because it was, again, a compromise. It avoided both terms, homoousios and homoiousios, and supporters of this new creed forced, for example, Pope Liberius to sign it, along with a condemnation of Arius. So this is they're trying to not trying to defend Arius at this point. They've kind of gotten beyond him, don't want to go as far as he does. And in fact, at this point, sometimes, and I'll get to this in a moment, because there are several different versions of what we call Arianism. You had the triumph by the end of the 350s about something we call semi-Arianism. By now, many Eastern bishops have realized that you can't actually deny the unity of the Father and the Son, so you can't do what he did. And so they hold a council in which they release a statement using the term homoiousios, and this becomes the sort of default position for a majority of bishops. And a few years later, they arrange for a fourth council at Sirmium in 359, which produces a confession, which promotes a compromise formula, which uses another term to refer to Christ. Instead of homoiousios, it says that Christ was homoios, Homoios, which means like him, but omitted the phrase in all things. And so this formula will actually be reproduced in the next couple of years in various synods with minor changes, and by Constantius and by the synods that he holds, imposed on the entire church. So you have all this going on around about 360, 361. And I mention this because this is toward the end of Constantius' life, because his armies are facing greater and greater difficulties on the Roman borders. He goes to war with Persia, doesn't go well. And in fact, he's in the east fighting when, in 361, his cousin, Julian, one of the guys who survived the massacre of Constantine's family, is proclaimed emperor by his troops in the west, and he goes back to the west to try to put this role down, but he gets ill, dies on the way there, and decides before he dies to name Julian as emperor, which he does. And so for a brief period, you're going to have, and we'll get this in a second, I won't go into too much detail, Julian, who, by the way, was raised Christian, but was kind of, for a variety of reasons, rejected it, sort of came out as a pagan when he's made emperor in 361 and tries to restore paganism as the primary religion of the Roman Empire. However, one thing had already happened, because you had this persecution of the defenders of Nicaea, and I forgot to mention, basically everyone who didn't get along with Constantius's position was deprived. So basically, by the end of the 350s, every defender of Nicene Christianity has been removed. So all the major bishoprics were in the hands of major sees. They had no opposition. But this had two main effects. One is that you have, on the one hand, it led to a sort of circular firing squad amongst these followers, more or less, of Arius. So people emerged from Arius' teachings, and they fell out among themselves, and they couldn't replace the Nicene settlement with their own ideas because they all disagreed slightly on how Christ was divine. And there were three main groups, and I'll try to go through this, maybe spell this word out. One who they were eventually rejected by both of these groups, the Anomoeans, 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 so named because they thought that Christ was anomos, which means unlike the Father. So that's basically Arianism. It sounds like Arius' position. Another group called the I guess it was the homoousios, because they thought Christ was homoousios, of a like substance. And then the third group, the homoians, because they believed, I already mentioned this term, homoios, Homois, was like or similar to, which was kind of a vague compromise meant to cover all opinions, and they couldn't get along with each other. Other thing that happened is that the persecution of because it was the Homoians that were supported by Constantius. It led to the supporters of the Nicene Creed and the people who thought that Christ was merely like substance as the Father to come closer together as a result of all this persecution. And so this, by the way, was something that Julian didn't want, because of course he was trying to revive paganism. He didn't want a united Christian front, so he began persecuting Christians, and but he also exiled Athanasius again in 362. When Julian dies in 363, Athanasius will turn once again to Alexandria, holding out against all this. But his Julian's successor in the East, because the East has two emperors now, East and West, was a man named Valens, who was a supporter of Homoianism. And so he forced Athanasius once more for the fifth and final time into exile in 363. But the Alexandrians were on his side, caused such unrest. Valens was forced to recall him. And Athanasius returns one last time, in 363, in triumph. And he's never bothered again. He lives the last 10 years of his life. He dies in 373, championing Nicene orthodoxy. But you still have an emperor who supports the compromise. Valens becomes emperor in 364. Excuse me, 363. And he, as we'll see in a moment, reigns for 15 years. So another decade and a half, you have this, in the East anyway, this conflict with this anti-Nicene faction in the church, supported by the emperor. But by this point, you begin to have things turning. In fact, they're already beginning to turn in 362, even before Julian dies. Athanasius had held a synod in Alexandria in 362, which condemned Arius and helped reconcile those who had been forced to sign these formulas under Constantius under duress. So what he was getting is bringing unity back to the Church of Alexandria. And but more importantly, in terms of development of how do you clear up all this semantic confusion? They began to note other implications of Arius's beliefs, and one of them was the implications for the Holy Spirit, something that had gone virtually undiscussed before this, with the effect that not only did Arius's beliefs make the Son a creature and therefore diminished him, it also diminished the Holy Spirit, who, again, that's also thought to be divine, of course, and so brings that to the fore. And in fact, with the passing of Athanasius, you already have them coming forward, other champions, and these are the great Cappadocian theologians. They're called the Cappadocians because they're from that area of Turkey. Among them, the leader really of the Nicene party, to a large degree, after Athanasius dies, is Saint Basil. Saint Basil of Caesarea. I think it's Caesarea. I can't remember actually, but Saint Basil, the great Cappadocian theologian. who came from a Christian family in Pontus. Several of his family members become saints along with him. His sister Macrina, for example, was a saint. Later on, he abandons his career in government to join his family and sort of an ascetic. They set up a sort of ascetic compound, I guess, in their home. But becomes ordained a priest in 365 and then made a bishop in 370. And as a bishop, he begins to try to work to restore the unity of the Eastern Church. And as I said before, it kind of takes up, to a degree, Athanasius' mantle. But he was a much more rigorous thinker, systematic thinker in some ways than Athanasius was. One of his main contributions to all this was to develop the idea, we just mentioned, that Arianism downgraded the Holy Spirit in addition to the Son of God. And being more systematic and philosophical than Athanasius, Athanasius refused to use non-biblical terms. Again, you kind of see this with these early generations. They didn't want to get very far from the sources of the faith. But Basil he was trained in Greek philosophy, and he used these terms to draw out conclusions of Trinitarian orthodoxy in a much more logical way. And in particular, he stressed the importance of delineating much more clearly and thoroughly than Athanasius ever did the differences between the three persons of the Trinity. And in fact, he championed the idea that there were three hypostases in the Godhead. Again, hypostasis is that term which I mentioned earlier, but at the beginning of the 4th century, it wasn't really clear what it meant exactly. It's under the influence of Basil and other thinkers. I'll get to the other major one in a moment. That they begin to give it this, it means something like person in English, and begins to take shape. And so reconcile people would oppose this formula. The reason why they opposed it, by the way, is that Origen used that phrase. There were three hypostases, for the three, beings of the Holy Spirit. And Origen had some hanky sort of heretical beliefs, and people were kind of skeptical about it. With Basil and his other confreres, they're beginning to flesh out what Nicaea meant by the end of the 370s. And this is kind of, along with changes in the empire, what leads to the triumph of Nicene orthodoxy. One of the biggest things in political terms is the death of Valens. Their Gothic army, which has been, it's a long story if you know Roman history at all. The Goths had been sort of seeking shelter within the Roman Empire because you had people from Central Asia, the Huns, pushing them west. They were ill-treated by the Romans, and so they gathered an army. And at Adrianople, the Emperor Valens went to meet them and got wiped out. Massive, massive loss for the Romans, and Valens is killed. This leads to two emperors coming to power in East and West, Gratian in the West and Theodosius the Great in the East, who were both supporters of Nicene Christianity. So you have Orthodox emperors return, and they do what their predecessors did. They issued decrees in 380 and 381 imposing Nicene orthodoxy on all the Christians of the empire and depriving any Arians of both their offices in the church and their churches. So you had this attempt here. Still, even by this late date, by 381, there's still a lot of support in Constantinople for these ideas. They've been associated with emperors, I guess, perhaps is one of the reasons. I don't know exactly why. And so a couple of things happened to sort of put the stamp officially and make Nicaea's formulation fleshed out a little more, or a lot more actually, the orthodoxy of the church. And one of the people responsible for this is, again, one of the friends of Basil, Gregory of Nazianzus. And Gregory was a childhood friend of Basil, was ordained priest in 362, supported Basil in becoming the bishop of his area in 370. And however, they had a falling out because in 372, Basil got into a sort of turf war, jurisdictional struggle with another bishop, and in order to oppose him, he planned to, and he did actually make his friend Gregory a bishop, but Gregory wanted no part of this, and so when he was made bishop, he basically refused to take possession of his see, and then withdrew to a famous shrine, the shrine of Saint Thecla. It's in modern-day Turkey as well, I think. But is in modern-day Turkey, except for it was, and just basically withdrew from all this. Didn't want to do it. Didn't want the responsibilities. which is fascinating. However, in 379, he left his shrine to go to Constantinople. Why? Because he was called to take charge of and sort of effectively act like a bishop, to perform episcopal duties for the small minority of Nicene supporters in Constantinople, which was surrounded by a population that was still supporting, Arianism. And so this was in 379. So over the next 3 years, he would face attacks, both verbal and physical, from the Arians. There were several people that tried to, shout him down and try to, shut down the small church he had there for his community. But he managed to stabilize things there. And as well, he delivered a series of very famous orations. They're called the theological orations on the nature of the Trinity, in which he develops further the role of the Holy Spirit in the Trinity. And this is the major breakthrough here that happens, is that he begins to insist on the full divinity of the Holy Spirit. Again, before this, there hadn't been much discussion of it. People hadn't known, is it divine like Christ? Again, you're working out what it means these things to be divine. And he's the one who insists on, no, it must be also part of the Godhead, co-equal with the Father and the Son. This, of course, famously we'll get into the creed we still recite. And the creed we recite was actually created or written not by the Council of Nicaea. They take that creed and add this clause, especially about the Holy Spirit, at an Eastern Synod council that was called by the Emperor Theodosius in Constantinople in 381, which is, again, the one we use today, in which they confirm the divinity of the Holy Spirit along with the Son. And so that you have a trinity of three co-equal persons, as has been defined more or less ever since. And with this, again, Theodosius later on, Theodosius will be the one who actually makes Christianity the actual official religion of the Iron Empire, but this is effectively the end of the empire, end of Arianism in the East. It, by the way, will revive itself again through some of the Gothic tribes that get into Europe in the West, but it's finished here, and this is the end of this crisis. I should mention one thing about this, however, is that it wasn't clear at the time that the Second Council of Constantinople in 381 was actually an ecumenical council. There was another council meeting more at the same time in the West, at Aquileia, which is modern-day France, if I'm not mistaken, and which confirmed the same things, but it apparently wasn't really clear that it was. So it actually is only confirmed something like 70 years later. 70 years later, at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. So they didn't start even counting it as one until much later. So it's an interesting thing that it worked out that way. Again, I won't go through the later period of Arianism. There'll be that. Maybe I'll talk about it later when I talk about them. I'll do one of the barbarians and talk about that, who ended the Roman Empire. But that effectively came to an end within the Catholic Church in the empire, definitely, of support for Arianism. So a couple of things about the legacies of the Arian controversy in history. A couple of things we have to talk about here. One thing I've kind of stressed in this little discussion of the Arian crisis, is this, confusion, right? This confusion about what are we supposed to believe and why are we supposed to believe it, and how it took time for them to work these things out. And in fact, you get a lot of historians, again, this is modern historians who are probably basically all modernists anyway, but I'm going to mention this. A lot of modern historians especially don't like this period. They usually tend to be sympathetic with Arius. They basically, some historians go so far as to claim there wasn't really a crisis. They say there was no real crisis. It was just, it was basically the fault of people like Athanasius, who insisted on being right and everybody else being wrong, that caused this. And in fact, a lot of modern historians really dislike Athanasius for a lot of reasons. He's not, and one reason, by the way, is he's not an intellectual. He's a thinker. He had developed some thought, but he's not the same sort of philosophical theologian that the Cappadocian fathers were. And he is absolutely convinced of the rightness of his creed, as was Arius. And again, Arius, by all accounts, was a logical, rigorous thinker. By all accounts, led a good life. That's the other thing to note about this. It wasn't like he was some sort of deeply immoral person. And it seems to have bothered modern historians that this was an actual, that this was all ginned up. This was like a political thing primarily, that somehow was a political settlement, the Nicene settlement. And I won't go into this too much detail or bore you too much with it. One historian literally called Arianism the archetypal heresy, quote unquote. He didn't mean that in a positive sense of being like, the sort of model for all heresies. He meant that like this is a way, the insinuation, I think maybe I kind of said it, but the insinuation is the church basically uses as a template to condemn doctrines unfairly, in other words. The effective thing is that the church just made stuff up. I say this because I reject that a hand. They weren't just making stuff up. They really were fighting over things that mattered a lot. It mattered how could Jesus be divine? It's a big thing. I mentioned this earlier. Like the classical world had a real problem with this, and all of a sudden you had people who really believed this, but now they've been, they've embraced this faith, but they've been shaped by this very, very rationalistic Greek culture, and they couldn't just let it go. And one of the things that happens in sometimes in the history of the church is that, I did an essay for Crisis Magazine a month or two ago, and it was about development of doctrine. And it's funny how when people mention development of doctrine, they almost never mention, things like this. They make it sound like doctrine just sort of, inevitably develops, or it develops through, theologians writing books or something. The honest truth is that a lot of times things only develop when there's a serious conflict and somebody gets condemned as a heretic. Other words, somebody can be definitively wrong. I think that bothers a lot of modern people because they don't like it. Because you're condemned, that's it. You're done for all of eternity, and that offends some people. But that is kind of the implication of this. The church believed you could know, what truth was. You could know the truth about God, and if you got it wrong, you're responsible for it. That's what heresy means, by the way. It means something like heresis means something like choice, like you made the wrong one. And so I reject the fact there's an insinuation that, the church sort of made this stuff up. They didn't. They were trying the best they could to get these things right. Could churchmen have been, more conciliatory? They can always be more conciliatory. They almost never are. But these types of conflicts sometimes are the only things that force things to develop a lot of times. And so my point is that sometimes it might be necessary for things to move forward, or at least may come to that point. But I don't buy the criticism of Athanasius, and I certainly don't believe that. Again, the insinuation is that Arius got a raw deal. Look, Constantine did basically force everyone at not everyone, but pressured the bishops at Nicaea to make that statement. But again, so did all these other Arian emperors. They all did that. Sometimes ideas went out because they are more, they're true, right? One of the things, for example, that the great church historian Peter Berger mentioned about this debate between Athanasius and Arius and these different ideas of God is that if you accept Arius's idea that God is alone God, and the Son has nothing to do with it, Christ has nothing to do with it, well, that means you don't really have God. God didn't really come down and sacrifice himself for men. And therefore, we really don't have as intimate a relationship with him as we thought we did. Peter Berger makes the point that, as the empire is beginning to sort of crumble in the 4th and 5th centuries, that becomes really meaningful to people. They desire a more intimate connection with the divine, and so it wins partly for that reason as well. And yes, politics is a part of life and history. That happens. But it also speaks to the intrinsic, worth of the ideas. It's not merely a matter of politics. And finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, I want to talk about what this means for us. I talked about the crisis we're undergoing now within the church and within the world itself. Are we living through another Arian crisis? This claim has been made by people I respect, and there are in history there are always there's always continuity and difference. And when you make these sorts of analogies, they work and don't work. I mean, there are definitely similarities. As you can kind of see, you have effectively, as we do today, you have a lot of people in authority who don't believe in basic doctrines of the church. Arius basically rejected a basic doctrine of the church, and you had people who support him in that. So you have people in places of high authority in the church who deny basic teachings of the faith. You also have these people imposing ambiguous doctrinal formulas on the church. It's also very similar to what's going on today. I mentioned the creeds that Constantius imposed effectively on the whole church. And then, there's the length and severity of the crisis itself. It lasted for decades and really didn't. The whole Christological controversy over, who Christ was lasted much longer. It took a long time to work that out about the nature of God to people's satisfaction. And it was severe partly because it affected everyone. Even though these debates were very, kind of esoteric, philosophical discussions of the nature of God. I want to say it was either Basil or Gregory of Nyssa, I can't remember which one, that during the high days of the Arian Crisis, I can't remember which theologian said this, but they talked about how everyone was talking about this stuff. People in the marketplace. I think it was Gregory of Nyssa who said he would go into the marketplace to buy bread, and he'd ask a baker for bread, and he would get, well, the Father is greater than the Son. So this stuff really bitterly divided people in that vein. So that's very similar to what's going on today. However, there are some major differences. One is that we're going through all this while at the same time we've been going through a massive moral crisis. I mean the sexual abuse crisis as well. It doesn't look like to me most of the Arians were pedophiles. They weren't perverts. Again, Arius was known for the upstanding nature of his behavior. He was not a horrible person. He was not Ted McCarrick. Another difference is the nature of the content of the conflict itself. The great Catholic historian, Richard Rex, Cambridge guy, recently gave a talk in which he said the church was going through the third great crisis in its history. This crisis, the Arian crisis, was about, the nature of God. Who is God? The second one would be the Reformation. Okay, what is the church? And the third one, I think he's absolutely correct, is that the third crisis, which kind of begins in the 19th century, is what is humanity? And so I think it's different in that regard. It's not really about God's. It is about God, but it's about our nature. How did God create us? How did he make us? Another difference is we live in just vastly different societies. I mean, it's so wildly different. There are no emperors. I guess you could say there's an empire, an American empire, a global empire, I don't know. But different social, political structures. Technology is so different. Back in the Roman Empire, late Roman Empire, they would, if you lost public office, they would actually try to destroy your memory through what a series of practices modern historians call a damnatio memoriae. They would strike your name off of all public monuments. They would try to destroy all your books and stuff so that nobody would know who you were. Well, you can't do that anymore because we have all this tech. But what you can do is you can reproduce false statements or ambiguous statements about the faith over and over and over and over and over again, which we have gotten all too used to in the last 10 years. And then finally, there's no emperor against the church today. But you could argue the collective power of secular society. I would argue that any powerful nation state today is 10 times more powerful than the old Roman Empire. More wealth, more technological power. Take all of them together, you could say that the forces arrayed against the church are much stronger. What does that mean for us? One of the reasons I embarked on doing this podcast in the first place is, partly, I always say this is not an apologetic podcast. I'm not doing theology, and I'm not trying to make excuses for this or that thing. I'm trying to clear up historical misunderstandings. But I do want to say that one of the things I do, another reason is to clear up things. There are usually misunderstandings about the church, sometimes out and out lies. perpetrated about its history for propaganda purposes, those sorts of things. However, another purpose was to try to, in the most calm and dispassionate manner I can, present to Catholics some parts of their history that are kind of troubling, maybe very troubling sometimes. And in fact, I would say that sometimes in our own lives, but also in the life of the church over millennia now, God's providence can be kind of terrible. He can work through awful situations and allow awful things to come to pass through horrible political messes, through horrible things. And it's not always pleasant to contemplate. And I'm especially thinking about today, because every time I get on social media, I hear somebody say something that, that they're getting tired of the whole crisis, that they don't know what to do, that, it seems like, I came across something the other day, I think, maybe this morning, I can't remember, basically someone complaining that it seems like, most of the bishops are just like, functionaries of the New World Order or something like this. In other words, they're unreliable. They're not doing anything for us. We've been abandoned. And I don't know the reasons for all these things that are going on. I will say a couple of things just to, I mean to encourage you is my point, but one thing is that, why are we going through this? Why are people that should be, propagating the faith, seemingly trying to undermine it? And again, I can't answer that. What I can say is that these people, who I'm talking about, cardinals who make outrageous statements, which doesn't narrow it down, but there's plenty of them. We know that in this world, there's more than human power at stake. These people probably think they're doing the right thing by trying to subvert the church's teaching, but they're actually working on behalf of forces that are bad and want to harm us, that are evil, in fact, right? And those evil forces that are arrayed against the spiritual forces, and there's also human ones too, but really things that are bigger than this world. I think the reason these things come to pass, the reason these things happen, I think they're meant to discourage us. I think they're meant to demoralize the faithful. And, it's tough in life. Sometimes there's just not a lot you can do. And then there isn't, by the way. If you're a layman and you're concerned, there's not a lot you can. There are things you can do, don't get me wrong, but directly. You don't have any authority. I have no authority. So we can't do a whole lot directly. One thing you can do, and this is something, and I'll end with this. This is why I really resent the sort of some of these scholars and historians, I think, I won't say calumniating, but denigrating Athanasius, is that the thing about Athanasius is not his intellectual acumen, but his courage. His courage. He exiled 5 times. The fact that he refused to give in. That's the biggest thing. To despair, to actively embrace despair is a sin. It is. We don't have a right to despair about God's love for us. And I think, when you think about Athanasius, was a hard guy. He was not touchy-feely. I think you have to admire that courage. And again, we're not Athanasiuses here. I'm not an Athanasius. But you can always begin by not giving in. At least a little bit to whatever is going on in some way. And the more you do it, the easier it becomes. And when enough people refuse, that's when you begin to have an impact on things. I think that's the biggest thing, is to first and foremost thing is to refuse to give in to that demoralization, that despair. There are signs of hope. There were things in the Arian Crisis. I'm sure a lot of people thought there's no hope for the future. There was hope for the future. There is hope for the future. You know it when you see young priests who are faithful. You know it when you go and you find monastic houses that are living their charism in ways that are authentic. You know this. And so the big thing is to try to keep, as bad as things are, don't focus all of your attention on those things. That's what gets you demoralized. Now, it's hard to do, but look for those rays of light, and look for the people who are like Athanasius, who refuse to sort of get into that. And so just to give you some encouragement, I'll leave you with a little quotation from the French leader, Charles de Gaulle. I've been on the brain. I've been reading a biography of him lately. Who, in 1943, in the middle of the Second World War, when he was in exile, when France was occupied by Germany, and gave a radio speech to encourage the troops back home in France, and told them, quote, "Let us be firm, pure, and faithful. At the end of our sorrow, there is the greatest glory in the world, that of the men who did not give in," unquote. Men like Saint Athanasius during the Arian Crisis. So that is all for this episode of Controversies in Church History. If you liked it, I thought it was great, go tell your friends about it. Go spread the word. Tell them to subscribe. Go to Spotify. Go to Apple Podcasts. Sign up for it. Follow us there. Leave comments if you would. I'm going to try again. I'm trying to make this a more interactive thing as far as I can. I know some of you, I think someone left a comment. I'll get back to you if you're listening to this momentarily. I've been busy a little bit lately, but let me know what you think. Let me know what you might want to hear more of. Go like us on Facebook. Say hi on Twitter if you're around. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel. I'm trying to monetize it, and so I need more subscribers there. Like there. Again, website, churchcontroversies.com. I have all the links to things on there. I also have, I'll blog there from time to time, some new material there. So go visit the website if you would. And oh yes, if you like the content, you want to help out the podcast, go to Controversies in Church History on Patreon, a Patreon page where you can donate as little as donate 3 levels of donation or whatever. Become a patron of the podcast. You get bonus material, bonus content, and early access to episodes. So if you want to do that, go do that. But in any case, thank you everyone for listening. I hope you guys having a great week, or have a great weekend, I should say, as I'm recording this. Thank you all again, and God bless you all.